Hey guys, how's it going? Love it. Gonna be reacting to The Cliches of American High School Culture by JJ McCullough. Now, he's a fantastic YouTuber, makes great content. He's very upbeat and positive and fun generally. And you might just want to go watch his video, or check out other ones of his. Creates great stuff. And I honestly haven't watched this video yet, but I thought, hey, American High School Culture. I'll give my opinion and comments on it. Now, I think in saying American high school culture, he's including Canada. I'm not sure, but he often does because Canada and America are truly very similar. We tend to point out the differences amongst our countries, but it's very, very similar. Two of the most similar countries in the world. Anyway, let's check it out.
Hello friends, my name is JJ, and the other day I was out shopping at my favorite tabletop game / Funko Pop store in the Greater Vancouver Regional District, TNN Games, in fabulous New Westminster, where I came across this delightful game, Epic Spell Wars of the Battle Wizards, Hijinks at Hell High. It is a very goofy and grotesque card game where you battle your friends by building crazy magic spells. It has this very cool cartoon art style that is very over the top and gross out, which I really like, though I can understand might not be for everyone. But the main thing that won me over about Epic Spell Wizards whatever is just that it has this very narrowly particular theme, which is the American high school. Longtime viewers will know that my imagination tends to be really stimulated by stuff like this because there is nothing I like more than things that are really dense with cultural references to deconstruct. And this game, which contains over 100 distinctive cards, each making reference to some unique cliche or trope associated with American high school culture, certainly fits the bill. So today I thought that we could maybe just go through a couple of my favorite cards, and I could tell you a bit about what each one refers to and how the things that they refer to became so associated with the unique world of American high schools. But before we get into the cards, let's just take a moment to talk a bit about how exactly high school became this huge American cultural thing in the first place. I know that whenever I talk to Europeans, they will often say that a lot of their understanding of American culture comes from watching the extraordinarily large number of American TV shows and movies that take place in a high school setting, which Americans in turn often find kind of funny because, of course, we all know that the Hollywood depiction of high school only bears the gentlest resemblance to what real-world American high school is actually.
I would slightly disagree with that. I think a lot of the visuals are fairly similar, and social aspects can be fairly similar. But
that still begs the question as to why there is so much American high school media out there to begin with, and why it tends to be as full of weird cliches as it is. So modern American high schools evolved out of what were once known as academies, where wealthy parents in the early 19th century would pay to send their boys to study for a few years before they applied to college. This was in the days before the concept of sorting kids into different grades had been invented, so it wasn't always super clear who exactly these academies were for. According to this fascinating book about the history of American age culture, your typical academy was a melange of boys, teenagers, and young men, in contrast to your typical one-room public schoolhouse where all sorts of randomly aged children would be dumped. But then, in the mid-1800s, heavily inspired by reforms that were happening in Germany at the time, American school reformers introduced the age sorting system we now know today, with elementary schools being for kids aged 6 to 13, or grades 1 through 8, with teenagers interested in continuing their education going to a 4-year academy, or, as they soon became known, secondary schools. And then anyone older than that went to university. Previously, it was not unusual to have like 14-year-olds going to university. The dawn of the 20th century saw these secondary schools, which were once mostly private things for rich kids, get gradually incorporated into the standard public school system that all kids were expected to go through. Child labor laws, as well as a transition away from a mostly farm-based economy, all helped contribute to a growing consensus that children should stay in school until around age 18 or so. The teenagers produced by the big American baby boom that followed World War II are often seen to have been an unprecedentedly fortunate generation, the first who were able to enjoy a stable and comfortable adolescence, uninterrupted by wars or depressions. They were also the first to be targeted as a particular consumer demographic with unique tastes and wants. Early post-war American entertainment featuring teenage characters tended to avoid telling stories about school because that was considered boring. Instead, they had them doing fun stuff like having parties on the beach. By the 1980s, however, the boomer teenagers were now old enough to make their own movies, and many of them saw high school as a very important and very particularly American institution that was a critical part of telling the story of what it was like to grow up in the modern United States. Sometimes this was done for laughs, with movies like Porky's or Fast Times at Ridgemont High, depicting high school as this ridiculously awkward place full of horny idiots. And sometimes the portrayal was more thoughtful, with the movies of John Hughes in particular being widely celebrated for using high school as a metaphor through which some of the deeper tensions in American society could be explored, particularly class. The late 80s and early 90s similarly saw growing interest in teenager-centered TV shows that took place in a high school setting. These could either be mostly serious, like Canada's own Degrassi High, or more goofy and lighthearted, like Saved by the Bell. It's worth noting that a lot of these depictions of high school tended to be rather anachronistic and dated, however, as they were often the products of men in their 30s trying to recreate memories of what their lives were like 20 years ago. So you have like kids wearing modern fashions but still hanging out at the ice cream parlor. As high school themed entertainment became a more common part of American life, it likewise inevitably began to develop its own cliches, with a stable roster of heroes and villains and conflicts that you would see over and over again. You see.
Real quick, I just want to say that what he said about how things seem dated is definitely true. My experience in high school was so far different from my parents in that almost no violence. If you did get caught, if you attacked somebody or something, there's a good chance you'd be thrown out of school. Basically no tolerance policy, and that would happen a lot in my parents' generation. A lot of kids would get beaten up and bullied and stuff like that. It did happen in my high school, but it was quite rare. And also there wasn't like such defined groups as when my parents were children. There were some people who were more into sports, but the people who were into sports might also be into the band or whatever, whereas like when my parents were kids, it was more like you were into the one thing and that was your identity. Anyway,
see a lot of this reflected in the Battle Wizard cast of characters. The rich prick, the stoner, the alpha bitch, the bully, the demonic principal. In the late 2000s and beyond, movies like High School Musical or shows like Glee reflected a growing willingness on the part of writers and directors to just unapologetically use all of the Hollywood high school cliches in a kind of playful, post-ironic way, openly embracing the obviously phony and stylized nature of the setting, but still using it as a way to tell interesting or relatable stories about teenagers, even if they weren't terribly realistic. And that is what I would say this game is all about. It's mining a rich vein of American culture, comprising a highly recognizable medley of stereotypes, satire, and nostalgia for things that only ever half existed. Alright, so let us take a look at some of these cards. There are a lot, and while I would love to analyze each and every one with you, I wasted too much time on that intro, so let's get to it. So as you saw, a lot of the game's character cards involve stereotypical depictions of members of various teenage cliques, with the existence of cliquish subcultures, of course, now being taken to be one of the defining characteristics of the high school.
One thing you might notice is that he pronounces the word as clique. I say clique, like as in a group. Also, he says a boot, which I would say about.
Experience. This grotesque fellow embodies high school jock culture, but more specifically football culture, with football being by quite a large margin America's most popular high school sport. According to the National Federation of High Schools, nearly 70% of all American high schools have a football team of some sort, and in any given year,
70%? I thought it was like 100, very close to 100. I suppose the ones that don't have one are very small private schools. I don't know. It's very rare. I don't know of any that don't have a. Maybe. Yeah, I don't think I know of any that don't have one. Maybe one.
America is home to over 1 million high school football players. Now, a character like this obviously plays into the stereotype that all football players are violent, muscle-bound ogres. But what's interesting is that when you study the history of high school football, it is less of an example of jock culture infiltrating the schools from outside than something that explicitly grew out of them. American-style football is a modified version of British rugby that basically originated in late 19th century universities in the United States and Canada for the purpose of providing gentlemanly contests to determine whose school was better, a topic of enormous concern to the rather narrow slice of the American elite who attended college in those days. And since they were once quite elite institutions themselves, early American high schools pretty consciously modeled themselves after American universities and incorporated a lot of the same traditions. So it didn't take long before high schools started creating their own football teams to play against rival high schools, just like the universities did. The supposed oldest rivalry in American high school football, in fact, between New London High and Norwich Free Academy, two schools in Connecticut, dates back to 1875, the same year that Harvard first played against Yale. Now, sports remain one of the few realms of American life that are still rigidly gender segregated, some might even say gender normative, and the fact that girl students historically never played football helped lead to the emergence of a distinct female student subculture that rose up around the footballers: cheerleaders. These days, cheerleaders are considered a real paragon of American femininity, celebrated in everything from pop songs to porn. But this is a relatively new development, and for a long time, cheerleading was not considered a particularly feminine thing at all. Riling up audiences before a big game is nothing new, but initially, it was mostly done by charismatic male students who would do acrobatic tricks and comedy routines and stuff, which only made sense because you do have to remember that for a long time, girls dancing was considered a somewhat scandalously erotic activity to a lot of people, and thus not necessarily something a school would want to do in front of a bunch of uptight parents. Social mores started to change in the 30s and 40s, with female dance numbers slowly becoming a bigger part of cheerleading performances at colleges and high schools. But by far, the vast majority of the tropes and aesthetics that we associate with modern-day female-centric American cheerleading can be attributed less to an organic evolution than the imposed ideas of a single man. Lawrence R. Herkimer, a former male cheerleader from Southern Methodist University, who in 1948 founded the National Cheerleaders Association. Old Man Herky's organization is a good example of something being in the right place at the right time. At precisely the moment that girls were starting to get more interested in cheerleading, the NCA was there to offer training camps and dance moves and uniforms. Basically, every single...
That dancing looks so basic and primitive compared to what they do now, but it makes sense.
Cliche that is now ubiquitous with American cheerleading, from the pleated skirts to the pom-poms to jumping like this, was dreamed up by Mr. Herkimer, who the New York Times recently mourned as simply Mr. Cheerleader. Alright, so here is another character that I thought was kind of funny. Advisor Adderall, who you can see is so tweaked out that his brain has jumped out of his head. Adderall is a mass-market prescription amphetamine introduced in 1996 that has risen to become a hugely popular drug among American high schoolers because of the way it is said to help kids with attention problems stay focused on their schoolwork. It is not a coincidence that the first three letters of Adderall are ADD. The joke of this character is that he is some sort of student counselor type who is pushing pills like a crazy man, which is an allusion to something that has actually become a pretty serious topic of conversation in American high school culture these days. Using amphetamines to treat behavior problems among students is very common in the US and Canada, in a way it is not common in other countries. In theory, this is because in other countries, the teenagers don't have the same sort of attention problems as they do here, but that conclusion has always invited skepticism as to whether or not the real problem is just that we have too many overzealous school administrators, like our friend over here, who are too quick to diagnose attention problems in students, whose parents, in turn, are too quick to treat them with pills.
It showed patients who are prescribed amphetamines like Adderall had a slightly higher risk of developing psychosis compared to those who received other types of ADHD medications.
Speaking of parents, this is a fun character as well. The Tiger Mom. You can see she's mauling the kid for getting an F. The whole idea of the Tiger Mom was first popularized in a 2011 book called Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother by the conservative Yale professor Amy Chua, who made the argument that ultra-strict parenting is the only proven way to get good results at
Tiger Mom, the one thing I would say is, like, they might be upset with a B. It doesn't have to be an F. I mean, a lot of parents would be upset with an F, but yeah.
With your kids, even though it is not politically correct to say so anymore.
You take the generation of Americans who pulled themselves out of the Great Depression. How do you think those people parented? I don't think their main concern was being service providers for their kids and arranging play dates. For them, parenting was about instilling a work ethic in their children and a sense of respect and responsibility.
The term Tiger Mom was originally intended to evoke a certain archetype of the strict Asian American parent, in contrast to the more wishy-washy white parent. But I would say the term has
That's not how my parents were, I can assure you that.
become less racialized as it has become more
I mean, they weren't wishy-washy.
popular. You can see the kid here isn't even Asian. Speaking of failed tests, this guy here appears to be failing his SAT, which in his case stands for satanic ass torture. In the real world, SAT stands for Scholastic Aptitude Test and is a multiple choice exam done on a form like the one he's holding here that colleges in the United States use to help determine whether or not high school grads get in. It tests
One weird thing is, a lot of the schools used SAT. Where I lived, most of the schools used ACT, and it's kind of allegedly it's more of an East Coast West Coast thing. So the West Coast is more heavily SAT, and vice versa. Allegedly, that's what I heard.
general skills in reading, writing, and math, but is created and administered by a nonprofit organization known as the College Board, as opposed to schools or the government. The SAT was first introduced in 1926, and in some ways is a kind of relic of a time in which testing people for their general aptitude for this or that was more in vogue than it is today. A lot of other Western countries tend to just make secondary students pass a single cumulative knowledge exam, with universities using your score on that to determine if you get in or not. But US universities are unique in how they consider your average grade in all of your high school courses, plus an additional test to determine some generalized intellectual fitness for college. It is a controversial system, but it has also helped keep American universities as some of the most elite in the world. If you are a foreigner who does not understand this system, congratulations, you've already been screened out. This sassy kid here is just beating someone to death with his glee
That's really funny.
club, which is a clever pun. High school glee clubs have, of course, been heavily popularized in recent years by the show Glee that I mentioned earlier. I think this guy is supposed to be based on a specific character from the show, but I'm not super familiar with it. But in any case, before the show came along, I would say that glee clubs were a slightly more obscure and old-fashioned American high school thing that a lot of modern kids didn't really know much about. And the weird name reflects just how old they are. A glee was originally an 18th century British term for a certain kind of song intended to be sung by a small group of men without music, in a style that I guess we would say was somewhat akin to what we would now call a cappella.
In junior year we take our ease. We smoke our pipes and sing our glees.
I am sure the music historians in the audience can describe the genre better. In any case, having a glee club on hand to entertain the masses was considered an important part of Ivy League university culture in Victorian-era America.
Oh my gosh. Huh. I lived near there for a long time, Pomona. Wow.
To sing the various school songs and so forth. And Because, as we said, early high schools tried to copy colleges, glee clubs soon became a high school thing as well. But of course, as this type of music fell out of fashion, the influence of glee clubs halted its spread across America. Those that survived had to basically reinvent themselves into what we would now just call choirs, where much larger groups of students of both genders sing normal songs with music, which is what the show is about. Though I do wonder if the popularity of the show has led to a rise of high schoolers wanting their choir clubs to be called glee clubs instead. All right, now
yeah, I was going to say that I never saw such a clear and large effect. No, I probably have, but in my mind, it's the largest culture effect I've seen on high school sort of thing, and like participation, I suppose. I heard something like Glee Club applications and groups membership went up like 300% after the show came out. So yeah, it was quite popular.
let us talk about high school food, which the game has a bunch of fun cards about. American high schools have had cafeterias since the early 20th century, and are in fact required to by federal law. The government has been trying to micromanage school lunches to ensure they meet basic nutrition standards.
This is such a joke. American governments, oh my gosh. I don't know if he'll mention this, but to get their lunches approved, they designated ketchup as a vegetable. They'll do stuff like that. Anyway.
For close to 100 years now, according to Bon Appetit magazine, and parents and students being outraged at the low quality of what the schools actually serve has been going on just as long. The game's cafeteria-themed character is called Sloppy Joe, which is a reference to Sloppy Joes, a kind of low-grade hamburger where the patty is all mushy and there's tomato sauce mixed in. According to this amazingly well-researched piece on the history of Sloppy Joes in Blue Apron magazine, like many iconic American foodstuffs, the sandwiches first became popular in the post-war period, but other than that, are of disputed origin. I guess because the idea of putting ground beef on a bun isn't exactly that revolutionary.
It can be really good. There's a sort of stereotype of them being very popular in American high school lunches, and I think that might have been more common when my parents were kids. I didn't really see it much when I was a kid. But they can be really good. It annoys me that they put celery in it usually. I don't know why. I hate that. I like celery generally, but it's bizarre to me. Anyway.
When it comes to explaining their popularity in high school cafeterias, however, the Blue Apron people seem to find more consensus, with lunchroom managers in the US and Canada agreeing that the messiness is actually an asset when it comes to getting kids to meet their government-mandated nutrition quotas. You can throw some veggies in there, and they don't know the difference. The same could be said for the two foods that these cards reference: Pizza Pockets and rectangular pizza. Pizza
gosh. Oh my goodness. Rectangular pizza, straight trash. Like, that they served in my high school, it was like cardboard. Seriously horrible.
Which is to say, these little dough pocket things full of cheese and meat and sauce first became a mass market product in the 1980s, thanks to what sounds like two simultaneous origin stories: an Italian man from Winnipeg who created the Pillsbury line, and two Iranian brothers from California who created the Nestle line. I would be curious if eating
pockets. Oh my goodness. They can be okay, but if you're going into it expecting it to taste good and be flavorful and fresh, it's not going to be that. But
this kind versus this kind is any sort of US-Canadian cultural divider. Rectangular pizza apparently traces its origins to a cafeteria cookbook released by the US government in 1988, according to another very in-depth report from Bon Appetit magazine. As the card suggests, kids have never been especially fond of this particular take on pizza, and often say it tastes like cardboard. But
hey! That's exactly what I said! I did not watch this video before, I swear. Oh my goodness, yeah. I guess it's not that crazy of a thing. He said what people say, yeah.
online recipes are any indication, students also tend to develop a powerful nostalgic longing for its distinctive taste after they
Are you
leave
kidding me?
school. This
Oh my gosh, it sucks.
card is the yearbook of the damned. Have a bitchin' summer, see you in hell, he says. High school yearbooks are yet another 19th century college tradition that eventually trickled down. Back in the days when only a small number of elite Americans would attend university, wealthy students would often commission bookmakers to make special books full of photos of them and their friends to commemorate the rarefied experience that they had gone through together. But as the 20th century progressed, changing technologies eventually made photo printing and bookmaking cheap enough that even the crummiest high school could afford to partake in this once elitist tradition.
They put a ton of work in the yearbooks. Like it's like a job for a lot of the kids that, because the kids will make it themselves. They might have help from faculty. They might even not. But I maybe in some schools the faculty makes it or whatever. I don't know. But yeah, in my high school there was a club called Yearbook, where that's what they did. They made the yearbook.
And mass-produce hundreds of yearbooks for every single student for free. It is an interesting commentary on the
we had to pay for ours. It wasn't free. I didn't want to pay for it, but my mom bought me the yearbook, so that was nice.
The shifting American educational landscape, that the concept of making a college yearbook now seems completely unreasonable. Given that so many kids go to college these days, you can barely even fit the names of a single graduating department on the commencement program. Okay, so here we have a card called the Croaker Frog God of Death, and you can see his insides are pouring out. Dissecting a frog in high school biology class is one of those things that is such a narrowly specific American high school cliche that foreigners could be forgiven for thinking it is something that Hollywood dreamed up, but no, it has been a real thing since at least the 1920s, and from what I can tell, continues to be a common practice at high schools across the US and Canada to this day. In fact, it is big business. Check out this high school frog distributor based in Quebec, where you can buy a bucket of 100 dissection-ready frogs for just $499. Dissection is a useful way to learn about biology, but near as I can tell, the reason why we dissect frogs specifically is just because they are a relatively complex organism that can be found in quite abundant numbers across this continent. Some people on the pro-frog dissection side will even argue that companies like ProLab Scientific are doing us all a favor by killing so many of them, because in some places frogs are an invasive species that ruin the crops or whatever. I say the pro-frog dissection side because this has become a somewhat polarizing issue in recent years. Our friends at PETA have been waging a campaign to end the practice of high school frog dissections for a while now, and many modern high schools will allow you to opt out of dissection class if you find it inhumane. They even have digital frog dissections you can do now to avoid the ethical dilemmas. Though at that point, why don't you just dissect a digital human? Alright, now lastly, I want you guys to help me out with a card I do not completely understand. One thing I really like about this game is that it has a good mix of old and new references. So in addition to references to classic things like Sloppy Joes, there are also more contemporary callouts to things like weebs or memes, but this card I do not quite understand. The character is called Zakaton, Mechanical Muscle Mage, and seems to consist of a mix of references to like tech stuff and weightlifting. I asked a bunch of my friends about it, and no one really got it, but that is probably because we are all too old, and this alludes to some mix of unique subcultures that have arisen in high schools since I graduated, which was when? Exactly 20 years ago. Dang, I gotta get to the reunion.
That was interesting. He talked about more meta type things, like the surrounding high school, or like, I don't know, what I thought he would talk about more was interpersonal and kind of pop culture type of things. He often talks about that. But yeah, interesting, and thanks for watching. Maybe if you would comment, like, subscribe, that'd be cool. But if not, it's fine. And take care. Have a good one.